Salutations and welcome. Our episode today is presented as part of the first Geekspanic Heritage Month, a celebration of Hispanic heritage, Latinx history, National Hispanic Heritage Month, which is from September 15th to October 15th. Geekspanic Heritage Month is presented as a partnership between Monomythic and Nerdtino Expo, the first East Coast Latinx comic book convention. Joining me today is David Bowles, professor of literature at UT-RGV and the award-winning author of They Call Me Güero and many other books. And David, I want to thank you very much for joining.
Yeah, I'm happy to. This is going to be a lot of fun. We have been meaning to talk for a while, Kevin, so this is a perfect opportunity to catch up and have people kind of eavesdrop on our catching up. It'll be fun.
That's excellent. Yeah, you and I first met at I think an anime convention of all things.
Yeah.
When I am not the biggest of anime fans, but I do enjoy it. But mainly I like the culture of sci-fi and fantasy, but I also love the idea of mixing culture with that love. And I think that's something that you and I have in common. People have been telling me for a while that I needed to meet you, so I was glad I did then.
Yeah, no, and I think we had some really good conversations, and we were on a cool panel together for Castle of Horror. And so, yeah, this is, a long overdue continuation of that conversation.
Geekspanic Heritage Month was an idea that was presented to me by Nerdtino, and I am a big fan of puns, so I actually really liked that title. But it does kind of lend itself to this concept of, what is the proper title to use? Nerdtino is a play on Latino itself, but it also prides itself as being Latinx. There's even a debate on how to pronounce that word.
Right.
Somebody I was talking to just the other week told me it was a Latinx, which was the first I'd ever heard that one. How do you feel about this idea of mixing this love of geekdom and culture?
I think it's fantastic. I think that a lot of people, when they think of the Latinx community, when they think of Mexican Americans or Cuban Americans or, any of us under this umbrella of quote unquote Hispanic or Latinx, they don't immediately think of us as being geeks, as having interest in speculative fiction and different types of what we would consider geeky entertainment. But we do. We love games. We love movies. All you have to do is take a look at the demographic breakdown of box office receipts for these big summer action films that are replete with science fiction and fantasy. And we're buying tickets left and right. We're taking the primos and the tias, and everybody's going down to check out the latest film. So I love what Thomas and other people are doing to try to promote a greater understanding of that and to have greater conversations and connect creators within our community together so that there's this kind of synergy and excitement, and we get the word out about the incredible things that we're all doing.
Now, on the note of creators, you are making a lot of waves as a creator of fiction, especially those targeted at, I was going to say young adult, but I feel like you're targeting a little bit younger than what is traditionally seen as young adult very often, which I think is an important market that's been kind of overlooked. I think in the early days of the whole young adult fiction, people were kind of overlooking that idea of that teenage to young adulthood. And now it's kind of gone the other direction where people are like focusing on young adulthood because they can make it into a movie franchise and then kind of overlooking the younger. Yeah, exactly.
Right. Yeah.
But that being said, my first impression of your work is actually I call it nonfiction.
Sure. Retellings of mythology and that's all more like nonfiction-y stuff. Retellings of legends and myths, or retranslations of pre-Columbian Mesoamerican, mainly Nahuatl, but also sometimes Mayan texts into English to kind of promote this, because there's a huge absence of understanding of Mesoamerican mythology in the United States. I think about the fact that you and I both, being Mexican American, going to schools in Texas. I assume you went to school in Texas.
Yes, as far as I know.
Yeah, the parts that you weren't sleeping through, you were in Texas.
Yes, and when they woke me up, I was still there. So between, I can't say.
But in the state standards, you have all these things about Roman and Greek and Norse mythology, but Aztec and Mayan mythology, for example, are never taught. And I think that the kind of work that I wanted to do initially was it kind of traced the path that I was going down myself. When I got to college at Pan American University in the late 80s, early 90s, I discovered in the classes I was taking that a lot of these really important cultural touchstones of the Mexican American part of my family, my dad's side of the family, had been erased from my experience as a student in public schools, even though I'm on the border, going to school in McAllen, Texas, just a few miles from the border with Mexico, in a classroom full of Mexican-American students with Mexican-American teachers and so on. And so I went down this rabbit hole when I was in college of looking into the origins of the border folktales that I had grown up with, that my grandmother Garza and my tío Jose Casas and all these other people had told me when I was a kid, finding their roots in like colonial Mexico, colonial New Spain, and then how those stories were anchored even deeper in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica. And so when I started like wanting to write these kinds of things, and I first started because just like you, I was a teacher for a long time, a public school teacher. I started pulling those stories into the classroom, retelling the stories as exercises when I had struggling readers in my classroom who knew the same stories that I did because they grew up in the same community as I did, but they needed to learn, short story elements and all these different things. So I would rewrite my grandmother's folktales as short stories, and that was kind of like the beginning of this work that I started doing. And eventually, a couple of decades down the rabbit hole, I came out the other end studying Nahuatl and Yucateco, the Mayan language spoken on the Yucatan Peninsula, and beginning to incorporate that into my work. First, like literally writing, retelling the stories, and then creating, fantasy and science fiction, both for adults and for younger people. I've gone progressively younger as my career has gone along.
I think that's important.
Those things. Yeah, no, I think so too. Look, there are so many gaps in the stack, Kevin, for Mexican American literature, so much lack of representation that every single one of us who's interested in writing could write, a half dozen books a year for the next 50 years, and we still wouldn't put a dent in the gap that exists. So I feel like I need to tell similar stories to like multiple age levels, multiple grade levels. And that's kind of what like pushes me to keep going younger.
I feel like I had a very, very similar background. I grew up right down the street from you in Brownsville, and there was, well, I mean, the joke of my friends is I had the least Mexican family they knew. I was third generation, but my family did like the opposite of just about all the stereotypes of like all my friends. But the thing is that regardless if it was my family or somebody else's family, there was often an emphasis of Spanish heritage more than anything else. I would meet, I'd meet somebody from a very traditional family from Matamoros, and they would say, "Oh, he's so light skinned. That's great," and you get a lot of that. And as I was growing up, I was just like yourself, just enamored with the mythology. But there was just this smorgasbord of Norse and Greek, mythology. You could easily find, if you're looking for it, East Asian mythology. But when it came to mythology, by the way, I would just be clarifying. When I say mythology, I mean it in the academic sense. I mean,
yeah, me too.
This is what I always get upset with my own students. They're not wrong when they use the word myth to mean false, because that's technically one of the definitions in the dictionary. But I prefer the definition of myth to be this is something that somebody somewhere believes in.
Right. Or believed in at one time.
Yeah. Whether they believe in it now or they believed in it at one time. That's why Bigfoot is a myth and Harry Potter is a fictional character. There's a difference. So that doesn't give it any kind of belief of falseness or truth. It's just somebody believed this. They told it to their kids. They told it to their grandkids. That kind of history. And like you were saying, I've always felt there was this need to have a spreading of this culture. To have like the way that there's movies about Thor now, and the way there've been movies about Hercules forever. It'd be nice to have movies about these legends,
or something like that. Yeah,
exactly.
And it's in order for that to happen, we have to make it cool. I have these conversations with John Picasio, who up there in San Antonio, and as we strategize, and we're always like trying to find ways like how do we begin to like game the market and get publishers to do things, and we're like constantly thinking about strategy and ways to help other creators like get into the marketplace and like open that door wider. We always come back to, we need to make this stuff badass. We need to make people like look at Mexican American Latinx culture and go, holy shit, that's badass. I want more of that. And that's key. It's very important that we continue to fight against, the kind of like racist hegemony that exists in the United States that oppresses Black people and people from other communities of color. But one thing that is true of the Black community is that its culture, whether because it's being appropriated, whatever, its culture is seen as being, badass and interesting, and a lot of people who are not from the Black community emulate that culture. And while that is that is hardly the answer to the anti-racist needs of this country, it certainly has been one step in the right direction. Getting people to see the culture as something that's valuable and that people want to participate in. And I think the same thing needs to happen with the Latinx community, because we're lagging behind on that. People are like, oh, what, like novelas about narcotraficantes, that's it, that's Mexican culture for you. Like, no.
It's funny that there's that term cultural appropriation, and there's something that I have said in the past that I think people looked at me funny when I said it, is that I wish they would appropriate more of my culture. And people are like, what? No, it's a bad thing. I'm like, no, I understand that. But when you can have certain elements of various cultures, whether they're the minority or the majority, that are recognizable throughout the world, and then other elements that are just only known within a small community, or even sometimes a piece of that community, I feel like the more that it becomes part of pop culture, the more it begins to seep in. The example I would use is like Dragon Ball. Everybody loved Dragon Ball when they kids growing up in the 90s and the 2000s, watched Dragon Ball. They loved it. And those that really got into it learned that, wait a minute, this is based on mythology. This is based on the Journey to the West.
Yeah.
So this all comes back to your books. You have one upcoming that I have been really, really super eager to learn about. And that is the Halfling, how are you saying, the Halfling Prince?
The Halfling King, the Rise of the Halfling King, yeah.
So tell me about the Halfling King. How does this work out?
So after the book that you've shown a couple times, Feathered Serpent, Dark Heart of Sky, came out in 2018, in the spring of 2018, and began to do really well, and won some awards, and was picked by Kirk as one of the best books of the year and so forth. Cinco Puntos, the publishers of the book, came up to me and said, it's a great book, general audience book that you focused when you're writing it on teens, but it contains a lot of translation and adaptations. We would love to find a way to make these stories accessible to a middle grade audience. And that's that audience that you were talking about that often gets left out of the YA, those kids that are in like upper elementary, 4th, 5th, and then middle school, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, right? So what we're thinking is, why don't we do a series of graphic novels adapting some of the key legends and myths in the book? And I was in the midst of signing a couple of deals with HarperCollins and Penguin Random House, stuff like that. And so I was a little leery of jumping into another big project. But I told them, look, I'm willing to do this, but I want you to consider my daughter Charlene as artist for the first book. She lives in Austin, my daughter does, and she is she did the illustrations for my Goddess of Twins books, and she is just really, really gifted. They were interested in seeing her work, and once they had taken a look at her portfolio and initial sketches that she did, they were like, "Oh yes!" And they hired her immediately. And so now I've gotten to do a book with my daughter. It's just really, really fantastic.
Honestly, her art just blows me away. Every time I see pages from the Halfling King, it's just. And is this her first time doing sequential art?
Well, I mean, no, it's the first time doing something sequential art that's been published.
Well, that's what I mean. Let me rephrase. Yeah. I mean, obviously, people can work or through personal work or through school, but I mean, like in terms of published work, is this her first published sequential art?
First published sequential art. That's right.
This is really polished.
Yeah, she did a really fantastic job, and this is one of the things when we do talks together, and hopefully once COVID is done ravaging our country, we'll have more opportunity to go into schools. But when we talk to kids and they ask her, because there are always aspiring artists, and they ask her, like, how did you get so good? And she goes, well, to do this sort of thing, you have to live and breathe it. I've been doing art since I was 4 years old, drawing. She tells them about the like crates full of notebooks where every single page is drawn on that she has. And so she built up over time this ability. And by the time she was like 13 or 14, she had gotten so polished that I was already like wanting to collaborate with her and trying to encourage her to do things. And we would do like little practice runs. I would say, here's an idea. Let me give you a script for a few pages. You draw it out. And so like most of her high school years were spent kind of hammering out the way she would do sequential art. And she's recently launched her own like web comic in addition to this thing coming out. So she's I think she's going to go really far. She's got a lot of talent and really has a good understanding of composition and action, movement and stuff like that. She's a really good character designer.
Well, there's a lot of life in the art that I'm seeing.
Mm-hmm. She despises backgrounds, but she's really good at working with characters.
I think that's true for a lot of artists, myself included. When I was in high school, was like, I will gladly do, the whole portrait of the character. You want to do the background? I'm just going to shade something in. We're good.
It's like the whole. It's like that's one of the cool things about like manga, is that the backgrounds are just they're just whatever. Like what matters is the characters and their movement. And what I like about Charlene's work is that you could see where she's borrowing a little bit from that, and she's borrowing from like American like cartoons. And then also like just infusing it with her own sensibilities as a Mexican American, young woman living.
Well, also just having an individual style is important for an artist, and she already seems to have that.
Yeah.
But speaking of the details, what is Halfling King about?
So the graphic novel is an adaptation of a very popular legend in the Yucatan Peninsula that it's about the city of Uxmal. If you've ever been to the ruins of Yucatan, a lot of people focus on Chichen Itza or Palenque or something like that. But Uxmal has this very, very distinctive pyramid that's kind of like rounded. It's very strange, very unusual. And there's a legend that's still told to this day. I mean, when I was doing research for Feathered Serpent, I went down to that area, to Merida and the surrounding area, and asked a lot of native Yucatecos, native Mayans, if they knew the story and if they could retell it to me. And it's still told to this day of a dwarf, a boy that's born out of an egg and doesn't grow any taller than about 3 feet tall, and he's raised by a witch. And there's a prophecy about him that he will pass 3 tests that the evil king of Uxmal will put before him, and he will become the king. And there are like associated legends about this figure, the dwarf king of Uxmal. And what I tried to do with this graphic novel, in the first place, when I did Feathered Serpent, I took like the original 2 in-print versions of the story that were recorded like in the 1800s in English by anthropologists. And then, like I said, I interviewed a bunch of different people in the area to try to get like modern takes of it. And then I just try to create a version that blended those together. But for the graphic novel adaptation, I needed to add a lot more. And so I went out and searched for other variants of the story and other adventures that the Dwarf King was supposed to have, especially fighting this huge serpent from the underworld, and just found ways to put it together, and created a sidekick for him, this spider monkey named Mash. So it's a pretty straightforward story. It's a chosen one kind of story, except that in this version, this boy has been basically created specifically by the Aluches, which are the Maya equivalent of elves, to become the king of Uxmal, to fulfill this prophecy and rule peacefully, so there can be a relationship between humans and Aluches again, because humans have kind of pushed the Aluches into the grottos of the area and the caves of Loltun and other shadowy places away from where they once reigned, and they want to restore the balance between the 2 groups. And that's what he is. He's a half human, half Aluche. That's why I call him a halfling. Of course, halfling is a term that was created by Tolkien, right? It's
right,
not,
but it has connotations with pop culture, which is kind of ties into our earlier stuff.
Yeah, and that's what I wanted to do. When I thought about it, I was like, okay, all of the versions in Spanish call him El Rey Enano, right? Which like literally means the dwarf king. But in English, when you say dwarf, in the fantasy tradition, you have like a very specific image that pops into people's mind, right?
And then if you're talking about the real world, you have an entirely different image that pops into people's minds.
Exactly.
So it's like neither one really fits.
Exactly. And so I was like, what do I want to make him be? And I was like, well, what he is essentially a halfling, like you might see in Lord of the Rings. Arguably, the hobbits are the descendants of halflings, of
right,
half humans and half elves. And so that's what I wanted to create. And then halfling, of course, was used by other people. I think, aren't they a race in the Shannara books?
You're talking about races that are kind of equivalent to elves. You're talking about, the idea of this halfling. And even if Mayan and Aztec mythology, and again, I'm using the broad blanket terms people are familiar with. I know that once you get into the weeds of it all, saying Aztec is not even super accurate, and saying Mayan means like 20 different groups. But to use the blanket terms of Mayan and Aztec, these cultures don't have that one-to-one, crossover with the way we as a society have grown to expect, Greek mythology to be or Norse mythology to be. Right. But they can have those parallels, which does, I think, lend itself very well to pop culture. Yeah.
And I think that's the task of, the Latinx creator who's tapping into these ancestral stories and trying to make them accessible, both to people in his community who don't know them, but also just to a broader audience, because you don't want to be writing just for your community. You want, like I said before, for other people to read the stories and go, oh, that's badass. And so the task is, how do I retell this story in a modern tropey medium that will preserve the important things of that ancestral story, but also take advantage of the tropes and the traditions of modern fantasy, because I think those are all good tropes, and if they're used correctly, and if they're kind of shaken up a little bit and subverted, you wouldn't want to create like a Lord of the Rings set in the Yucatan Peninsula and like just basically rename every single creature and make it. You don't want to do that, but
you're not just looking for one-to-one comparisons, but you need those cultural touchstones where people will be like, all right, that sounds kind of familiar, and then go a different direction.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, even though the book calls him the Halfling King, and Halfling is used a couple of times in the text, the word Alush is used, and we understand that he's half Alush, half human. So, it's just this interesting way of tapping into adapting, appropriating a European kind of term and for use in this other context that I think is really valuable. So,
on that note of taking culture and kind of mixing in pop culture elements, what is Clockwork Curandera? Because that is this idea of steampunk. It kind of gives that image of it in my head, but then curandera is a term that if you grew up in a Latino or Hispanic community, you're just inundated with that idea and that concept. What is that, and how can people see that one?
Don't you think? I mean, like when you hear that phrase, it seems like absolutely contradictory, like a complete paradox. Like, how in the world could you have a clockwork curandera? Curanderas, healers, use their hands and sometimes like magical properties of plants or just from maybe it's ethnobotany, but sometimes they kind of like ease into like the spiritual side of things to heal people. And something that's clockwork, something that's mechanical, is cold and divorced from like the natural world. And the idea came to me as I was thinking about different like classical properties that we could play with. I was thinking about the Frankenstein trope in the novel Frankenstein, and thinking about what it would be like for somebody whose identity and sense of worth and what makes them part of the community. What if a woman like that, a young woman like that, found herself transformed, had her limbs ripped away and had to have them replaced by mechanical limbs, so that she is now grappling with like this separation between her and the green natural world that she normally drew her magic from. And so I started developing this alternate world that would be northern Mexico and southern Texas. The Republic of Santander is what it's called. Alternate 1865. And in this alternate world, steampunk technology exists alongside indigenous magic. So
I feel like that's become like something that is necessary for steampunk, is that alternative history mixed with magic. And the idea of mixing that with curanderismo is just, I love it. I just love that idea.
Yeah, and I mean, just immediately when those two ideas came together, like peanut butter and chocolate in the old, remember those old Reese's commercials?
I feel like, is this one of those things where the concept came first or the title?
I think it was more, it's really hard to look because it's been so many years now.
That's fair.
Since the concept just came up. It's really hard in my mind. I want to say that the title came first, Clockwork Curandera, but it had to have emerged from my subconscious because I was thinking about Frankenstein, the ways of retelling Frankenstein.
Which is itself a beautiful story.
Yeah, exactly. And just trying to retell Frankenstein from a Latinx perspective, and then it's also just like really poetic Clockwork Curandera, lots of consonants there, alliteration. And so that's what this book, what the series is about, because it'll be a trilogy. It's this girl, Cristina Franco, who is a 17-year-old apprentice curandera. Her brother, who's been studying abroad, been studying alchemy, which can't be studied in the Republic of Santander because the Catholic Church forbids it, and they still have a lot of control in the Republic. Because in this alternate universe, when New Spain broke up, it became multiple different nations instead of just Mexico. So there's a Kingdom of Mexico, but there's also, the Yucatan is its own country, and the Republic of Santander, and there's like multiple different countries. So he's been off studying alchemy. He's coming back on a train. She's there at the train station waiting for him. And as the train pulls to a stop, a Zeppelin, you can see in those panels, a Zeppelin is coming closer and closer. And out of the Zeppelin start pouring all of these lechuzas, right? Lechuzas are witch owls, and they're one of the coolest things. I know you had to have heard about them when you were growing up, Kevin. Brownsville is replete with lechuzas. All these witches that can transform into owls pouring out of the Zeppelin and attacking the train. And as she's worried about her brother, and she tries to use her curanderismo against them, but they are not impressed at all by her little meager green magic, and they rip her. They rip one of her arms off and both of her legs and leave her dead. Her brother takes her back to the monastery where they used to live, because their parents, they're orphans. Their parents died when they were younger, and their aunt, who's the mother superior at this monastery, has raised them, and he's got a lab in the basement. So there's this monastery sitting,
as one does,
of course. Yeah, your mom's the mother superior at a monastery. I mean, your aunt is.
Yeah, and if you're an alchemist, you're going to have a lab nearby. It's just stands to reason.
All the Frankenstein-y dials and switches and stuff like that, and he brings her back to life, attaching on limbs to her. Yeah.
Who is the artist you're working with on this? Because it's interesting that you're describing all of these kind of fantastical, almost sci-fi elements, but the art has this feel that gives me this impression of maybe Revolutionary era Mexico, where I have that feel of that.
That's exactly what Raul Gonzalez is trying. So Raul Gonzalez, known artistically as Raul III, is the artist on this. And Raul III, he's from El Paso. He's probably best known for his Lowriders middle grade graphic novels that he did with Kathy Camper. But he also does these really great children's books for Versify, the Vamos series, which are really fantastic. And I mean, he's a great gallery artist as well, and his art is all over the place. And he's got a really distinctive style. And early on in the process, we began to collaborate. He is credited as co-creator of the series because of his ideas and sensibilities really influenced a lot of the storytelling as well. And that's what he wanted to do. He was he wanted to take those broadsheets from the Revolutionary era and the kind of art that was being done, and do something that would feel like from that time, which I think is just unique, and I think it's going to blow people's mind when they read the whole comic, because it's not like anything else that's ever been done. It's so wholly unique, sui generis. It's great.
Honestly, what I've seen so far is pretty amazing. In fact, that actually brings up a question I have. We're talking about, that target range. Halfling King seems like it's aimed at kind of a younger teenage audience.
Yep.
Is Clockwork Curandera, am I wrong in thinking this is aimed at more of an older teenage audience?
It is. It's definitely older YA. There's lots and lots of like violence in it.
Gore.
There's some gore, although because it's the sample pages that I sent you are not exactly the way it's going to be colored. So when you see the way it's colored, it's even more like those Revolutionary area broad streets, the way they've decided to do the coloring.
Wow.
There's lots of, science fiction-y, fantasy kind of violence in it. There are some curse words, but like at the heart of the trilogy is like this kind of like political conspiracy, which is just a little bit too maybe sophisticated for like younger readers, and there's a lot of like religious things and so forth. So it's definitely a book for older teens and for adults. Frankly, it's going to be one of those crossovers that it's being marketed for. The main characters are all in their late teens. It's definitely marketed for those kinds of readers. But it's a book that I think a lot of people who are older are going to get a big kick out of. And
as a teacher and as somebody who's worked in publishing, I've noticed that if you have a target group, you have that younger group that says, "Oh, I can get up to that. I can totally aim for that." And then you have that older group that says, "Oh, I have nostalgic for that kind of feeling. I'm going to read it again." So you have that target group that maybe say, "Oh, it's young teens or older teens," but it's like, nope, those young teens are going to be like, "We're going to jump in and check that out." It makes it forbidden,
It does, yeah, because they're like, "Ooh, okay, wow."
Yeah, no kids better be watching this. It's reverse psychology. You're not supposed to know this.
I think a lot of kids have figured out their parents' cheap ass reverse psychology. But yeah, no, totally. When I was writing it, I was thinking about older teens and the kinds of things that they would be expecting. There's a romance subplot. There are two romance subplots. There's queer representation in it because Christina's brother Enrique, the alchemist, is gay, and one of the mysteries is what has happened to the boy he was in love with, because he's left and gone to study alchemy, but the letter stopped coming from this Afro Mexicano that he had fallen in love with, and part of the thing that they have to figure out is what's gone on with him, and all of there are a couple different strands of the mystery, and they come together gradually so that by the third book everything is revealed, and it hopefully is a compelling conclusion that gets people excited.
Spoilers.
Yeah, exactly. The first book is called The Witch Owl Parliament, which I just
couple meetings there, yeah.
Yeah, I just love because of course a group of owls is called a parliament, right? So.
And then the Witch Owl, could you really quickly, I know you have an article on medium.com, I think, about witch owls, but could you really quickly describe for people, when you say witch owl, I think even curandera, which is a term which is kind of growing in familiarity with people outside the community, is a faith healer, right? That's a faith healer that mixes kind of traditional medicine with very often Catholic beliefs, not always that straightforward, but a mixture of. But witch owl, I think, is farther away from.
You're right, exactly. And so a witch owl is a sort of shapeshifter. It's a witch or wizard, a witch or a warlock, but normally is considered a female witch, who has the ability to, either through spells or through some kind of inborn talent, there are a couple of ways of doing it, to transform into a large, usually screech owl. That's typically the owl. It could be a barn owl as well.
And I know that I've heard rather that for early Mayan communities, the owl was seen as like a symbol of death. Like you'd see owls or hear owls before somebody is going to die, and because it became a sign that their spirit was going to be taken, essentially.
That's right. So the tecolote, which is a particular species of owl in Mexico, is considered to be a harbinger death. And when you grow up in the valley, like if you're wandering out at night and you see an owl, like one of the ways my cousins told me you could get it to go away is like cursing at it, Vete a la chingada, pinche lechuza de mierda. And so you could say all these crude things to make it go away. But the lechuza is not something recent. It's like millennia old. The Aztecs, to use the same blanket term as you did, the Nahua peoples of pre-Columbian Mesoamerica believed in a type of shapeshifter, type of Nahuali called a chichtli, and a chichtli was this type of witch that shapeshifted into an owl. The kind of magic that she would use to do that was chichiotl, and that's witch owl magic. And so it's deep roots in ancestral lore, and it's survived into the present, throughout all the mestizaje that's happened in Mexico and into the Southwest United States. And there are also like other indigenous groups in the United States who also believe in witches who could transform into owls.
Yeah, there's a lot of crossover between different groups. That's why when we use the catch-alls, or at least the more popular names, it's like there's a discussion I've had with people. The comparison I make is like if you're to talk about Jupiter versus Zeus, where there's a crossover between Greek and Roman gods, but there's some extra ones here, some missing ones here, or they changed. It's not as one-to-one, but there's so much crossover.
That's right.
The communities of Mesoamerica and
the Uto-Aztecan peoples of the.
Yeah, I was going to say I should go farther north to the Hopi and stuff.
Yep. Yeah, Hopi and Shoshone and these other groups that are from the Uto-Aztecan like cultural linguistic family. A lot of them have overlap, and of course other groups as well because they're borrowing and going back and forth. But yeah, no, I mean both of those graphic novels, even though they're kind of directed at different readership and they have different the styles of illustration are very different. They both do something similar in that they're about taking this ancestral knowledge and legends and so forth and bringing them in to the present through this incredibly responsive medium of graphic novels. And what I think is so interesting about it is that Mayan and Nahua people created. I mean, their literature was essentially Graphica, right? I mean, the Aztecs, they didn't have a syllabary or an alphabet.
Not as I was explaining to somebody the other day, not as straightforward as say Mayan, where you could actually read sentences practically.
Exactly. But even with Mayan glyphs, you would have like glyphic stuff, and then you would have images illustrating something. So you would have this combination
graphics and text.
Of graphics and text, and so it's very, very much a part of the cultures from which I'm pulling to create these things, and so it adds this additional layer of meaning or specialness to the projects, and both of them are coming out in Spanish as well. I love the fact that with the Halfling King, Penguin Random House is putting out the Spanish version, which I've translated.
Has there been any discussion in trying to get a indigenous language translation?
The whole thing is
it'd be harder to publish that, like in terms of numbers, but it would be interesting to have.
No, I mean, it's one of those things where if we were to do something like that, it probably wouldn't be with one of the big five because they're not going to do something like that, a novelty kind of project like that.
The big five being publishers.
The big five publishers in New York, right? But there are, I could see a possibility of like one of these smaller presses that put out like limited, 100 print runs of things, being interested in putting out like a version of the Halfling King in Yucatec Mayan or something with Nahuatl. But both of those books actually have like the Clockwork Curandera has Nahuatl. The spells are either from either Nahuatl or they're from other indigenous languages of the borderlands, like Cuauhtecan languages. And also in the Halfling King, they're all in Yucatec Maya. All the spells that the Halfling King uses are in Yucatec Maya. So
keeping it to the cultures that are relevant there.
Yeah, right. And I wanted to like provide that texture because presumably the Halfling King is always speaking in Yucatec Maya, and so when he says a spell, it's not like he's switching to a different language. He's just saying the spell in his language. but it adds this really interesting texture when you do it, when you include that original language in the text for modern readers.
As we talked about, your middle grade writing, and then your kind of, I guess, what would you call it, upper grade writing? But then I wanted to talk to you about 13th Street, because these are not as pervasively part of the Latino culture as some of the other ones are. It's kind of like you were saying, reaching out to other communities, making people feel included, but it's also definitely aimed at a younger demographic. What is 13th Street?
So 13th Street is what we call a chapter book series. Chapter books are intended for kids ages like 5 to 9, who are moving out of like picture books and like these early readers and getting into books that actually have chapters in them. It's a highly illustrated series. The artwork is done by Shane Cluster, who's a great guy, and I've just had so much fun working with him on it. And Harper, the original, like, I guess, pitch about this is a Latinx Stranger Things for kids ages 5 to 9. So that you have these 3 cousins from South Texas. They're Mexican-American kids, although 2 of them have parents who are not Mexican-American. So Malia.
I know what that's like.
Yeah, me too. So Malia Malapata, because their moms are sisters. So Malia Malapata, her dad is Dominican, so she's Afro-Latina. And then Ivan Eisenberg, his dad is a Jewish American. And so, though his mom is Mexican American, he's also Jewish American. And then Dante Davila, well, both of his parents are Chicanos, so it's like he's the one pure Mexican American in the group. And they're spending the summer with their aunt in Gulf City. They live in the town of Nopalitos, which is supposed to be like Alice or Falfurious or one of those like, not quite San Antonio, not quite Valley kind of towns.
Yeah, it's South Texas, but not a large community.
Yeah, it's like the no man's land of South Texas.
Yeah.
And then they go to Gulf City. I have friends that live in those towns too. They go to Gulf City, which is supposed to be kind of like Corpus or Galveston or something like that, to spend the summer with their aunt, their single aunt who lives there. And they're super excited about it. They go to the municipal pool, or they're going to the municipal pool, and they take a shortcut and wind up in this place called 13th Street. And just like the Upside Down, right? That's what it's called. In
Stranger Things.
It looks a lot like a street in that city, in Gulf City, but like just all torn down, dark and somber, and there are monsters everywhere. And it's the street that just keeps going on and on and on forever. It apparently never ends, and there's no way to get off of it. And over the course of the first book, they realize that the first monsters they see, they find allies who explain these things to them. The first monsters they see, they've got to defeat them, and if they do, then a portal will open up and they can go back to their world. And over the course of the 6 books, because it's a 6-book series, they keep getting pulled back in again and again. The creatures get stranger and stranger, and you begin to discover what this place really is. I don't want to spoil it for anybody, but I will tell you, the conversation we just had about indigenous roots of things, there was no way I was going to write a series like this and not have it be about Aztec and Mayan stuff. So
it's going to come up.
It eventually, what the things that are revealed tie into, especially Mayan culture. And so I think once I give you that hint, then you can start taking a look at things and go, oh, bats. Where have I seen bats in Mayan mythology before?
Don't lose any heads.
Yeah.
I was going to say, looking at the covers, I get a prize. Looking at the covers of the books, I could see, even if they weren't obviously, very specific things, I could see the influence of that. And that ties back to our beginning of this conversation, which is the idea of making it, I keep using the word palatable, I think, but it's not necessarily palatable. It's just more familiar and welcoming to people that are like interested to know more, and then get kind of a little step into this culture.
It's like a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down, to continue like making all kinds of weird pop culture references. This is the cover of the 3rd book.
That's the cover I was thinking about, actually, when I was saying that.
And when you see it, you start going, I see some interesting things in these. The title is Clash of the Cackling Cougars, and you're like, well, these cougars are carrying objects and wearing things that seem awfully familiar to me. So yeah, I mean, by the time we get to books 4, 5, and 6, we're not hiding anymore. But in the first 3 books, you're easing people into this. And when you discover what 13th Street is and why it is the way it is, why does it look just like a street, like a broken down street in some Gulf Coast town in Texas? Well, there's a reason for it, and that's part of the fun mystery. So each one of the books is kind of self-contained, and that there's like an adventure that they've got to solve, whatever. But there's also like this through line of the mystery of the place and undoing the harm that's been done there. And I think it's a lot of fun. People have been giving me really good feedback about the first 3 books. And chapter books are traditionally the company that has like dominated that space has been Scholastic. And Scholastic book fairs and schools are something that we're all familiar with.
You talked about each of the kids having a different parent. Sorry, let me rephrase that. A different racial and cultural background.
Yeah.
And that's something I think when we talk about the bigger concept of Hispanic heritage, and whether you're using Latino or Latina or Latinx or whatever you're using, I've had to explain to my students before, I had a class of mostly students that were, the term used most often in Brownsville was Hispanic. Mm-hmm. And they would ask me, how come under race it doesn't say Hispanic? They would get upset at me. Why isn't it under race? Why is it a separate question? And I kind of had to explain to that idea that no, it's different than that. How would you describe this to people who are, checking this out for Hispanic Heritage Month and wanting to know more about the culture and the idea? The fact that you have, this I think you said a Dominican young lady, and then you have another student another child who I imagine is half white. I'm thinking, mm-hmm. And how do you explain this diversity while still being a culture to people? How would you describe that?
Yeah, well, I mean, to me, it's pretty straightforward. Being Mexican American, like you and I, or more broadly Latinx, we're talking about ethnicities, and within those ethnicities, there are different races. So there are, my brother Fernando he's an Afro-Mexican, or Afro-Chicano, because he is one of his parents is black and the other one is Mexican American, and for me, it happens to be that one of my parents is white and one of them is Mexican American. In Mexico itself, Mexico City was the first place on this continent to have a Chinatown just 50 years after the Spanish conquest. So, like, different races have lived in Mexico for a long time. If we use race in the sense that it's popularly used, which is it's problematic in its own way. But so basically, there's an intersection of race and ethnicity, right? So you can be black or white or indigenous and be, Argentinian or Canadian or Mexican, whatever you can be. They're 2 different things. So what happens a lot of times is that people who are black and Latinx, their black identity gets erased because people, especially in the United States, racialize the category of right. Hispanic or Latinx. So they treat it like it's a race. And when you grow up having your ethnicity treated as a race by the people around you, and that's what's happened in the Valley for hundreds of years, but at least for 100 years, ever since like white settlers came in at the beginning of the 20th century.
Well, I'm sure you could tie in the what would you call it, a caste system, I guess, with
the caste system in Mexico. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. The ravages of that had to do with it as well. But the kind of like homogenous Mexican American group that had emerged in the Valley by 1900 mm-hmm. was then racialized by the entrance of Anglo Americans who, when it was convenient, saw Mexican Americans, or maybe not saw them, but considered them white, like for legal reasons. If you wanted to have a jury of your peers, it would be all white men, even if you were a Mexican American. And to justify that, when people tried to sue, and this eventually went all the way up to the Texas Supreme Court and then to the U.S. Supreme Court, and Hernandez v. Texas in 1955, the juries were like, oh, but he's white and we're white, so we're all racially white. Pretending like they didn't treat his ethnicity as if it were race.
At the same time, they would have like a school for Mexican kids. The assumption being that, you're probably not going to continue school after a certain point, and you probably don't need school after a certain point, so you go to that school.
Yeah, and that you probably couldn't speak English very well when you came to school.
Just either. The assumption being, period.
Yeah,
even
exactly,
if you could.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I just wrote a leveled reader for an educational publisher about a big fight around that, because that was happening in South Texas as late as like the late 50s, and there was a really important case against Driscoll ISD, that they wanted to continue putting Mexican American children who did not speak a word of Spanish in the Mexican school. It's really, really weird. But yeah, so that's what I would tell people. Whatever you want to call it, because I don't really care what people choose to call it. I choose to say Latinx because I'm signaling, when I say Latinx, the fact that there are gente Latina that are non-binary. And so by using the X, by saying, si estoy hablando en español, diré Latine en vez de Latinx. It sounds better in Spanish.
Yeah, Latine with the E.
With the E, right. But just saying it is just a way of my signaling, hey, Spanish is kind of screwed up, and it forces you to choose between male and female. There are people who are non-binary. A lot of them are my friends. I care about them. I want them to be included in this conversation, in this secondary label, this umbrella term we're using. And so I choose to use Latinx. I don't get upset if somebody else says Latino or Hispanic. I don't care. They can say whatever they want, because it comes from what they feel. And so you may have seen, I was interviewed by the Washington Post a few days ago about this after the survey, the Pew survey came out, and they were like, see, most Hispanics don't even know what the word Latinx is, and the ones who do don't want to use it. I'm like, so I'm not telling them to use it. I don't give a shit what they use. They can call themselves whatever the hell they want to call themselves. But when I'm talking about them, I'm going to say Latinx. And to me, the problem is that there are people who get upset because I say Latinx.
Is that a form of gatekeeping?
Yep. It's a form of gatekeeping against queer people, because queer people, we're the ones who created the word Latinx, because we have friends who are non-binary. We wanted to find ways of talking about the LGBTQ plus community with a very, very densely gendered language. And I think that's something that people should just give us a break and let us do. Like I still have yet to see anybody trying to police anybody else's use of Hispanic or Latino. People claim all the time. On Twitter, I'm always getting into fights because these old school Chicanos come out and they're like, man, I'm so fucking tired of these wocosos. They call them wocosos, like woke wocosos.
I hadn't heard that one, but
it's hilarious, wocosos. I'm so tired of these wocosos.
And it's just real quick for a translation for people, the woke boogers.
Yeah, like a snot-nosed little brat also, right? So wocoso is like this bratty little
snot-nosed, yeah.
And who are getting on my case about wanting to say Chicano or say Hispanic, and like, nobody's getting on your case. Show me receipts. Please show me where somebody's attacking you because you chose not to use Latinx. It's not happening. It's not. It's a straw man, and I just wish people would allow other people to use the labels they want to use.
See, here's the thing. I grew up, I was saying earlier, I grew up in Brownsville, where the term that I heard more often than not, maybe it's different now than it was when I was a kid, but when I was a kid, Hispanic was the term that was always used.
Yeah, if we're not saying Mexican, we're saying Hispanic.
Yeah, or they just say Mexican, which I didn't like saying Mexican because, like I said, I'm third generation. I feel like because I had so many friends that were from Mexico that I didn't want to say I'm Mexican because I'm not from Mexico. Right. But then if I went to a place like Chicago or LA and I said Hispanic, people would look at me crazy. Like that's such a weak term. How dare you use that? So I had to get used to saying Latino, which is weird because to me that was a very foreign sounding word because we didn't hear that as a kid. Nope. And yet Hispanic was seen as offensive. And then I've met people of the older generation, older than myself and yourself, that found Chicano to be offensive because they told me that, look, I was just trying to work the fields. I was just trying to have my job. And these Chicanos were there trying to mess everything up for me because they associated that term with people who were more rabble rousers.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
They didn't like that term. And
So
when
you and I were kids, like if we had called ourselves Chicano, we would have got our ass beat.
But I have friends that embrace that term, you know?
Yeah,
so,
yeah, of course.
And like you said, people call themselves what they want to call themselves. The point is, it's still a big community. But I want to transition this to maybe one last topic to kind of tie everything together.
Mm-hmm.
You were talking about the very. I feel like what I would not say, they're both serious situations. I don't want to minimize one over the other, but we're talking about bringing the LGBT community in and helping them feel inclusive. That's important.
Right.
But when we're talking about indigenous cultures and things like, again, to use the blanket terms, Mayan and Aztec, is it okay for these cultural elements to be used? Maybe not, again, fetishized or whatever, but used or referenced by people who are more removed from it. I use you myself as an example. My mother was of Scottish descent. My father was of Mexican descent. Now the family always said my great grandmother was directly descended from the Aztecs, but that's way back.
Mm-hmm.
So is there a level of gatekeeping that is necessary there? Is there a level of inclusion that is let me phrase that would be encouraged?
Yeah, look, so it's definitely not an easy thing to work through, and I've had conversations about this on Twitter a lot. The way I look at it is this: the Mexican American, and maybe more largely the Mexican identity, is something that kind of evolved over time and was pushed into certain directions by mestizaje, by the caste system, and so forth. In Mexico, there are still obviously indigenous communities.
Mm-hmm.
But those indigenous communities, for the most part, are Catholic, Spanish-speaking. They're often bilingual. A lot of those communities preserve their ancestral language, and
even when they're not Spanish-speaking communities, there's still a heavy influence of Catholicism.
Yeah, exactly. Very, very influenced by Catholicism. The people are not practicing for the most part. Again, there are some small pockets, and there's a lot of syncretism in Mexican Catholicism. For the most part, people are not practicing the ancestral beliefs that we're referencing when we are using pre-Columbian Mesoamerican, sacred stories, mythology, legends, and so forth in modern work. So that's the first thing that I would say. We're not stepping on anybody's toes right now. There's not like groups of people who are worshiping Huitzilopochtli whose beliefs are going to be trampled on by using Huitzilopochtli in a YA novel set in the United States in the Mexican American community. Okay. The second thing I would say is that arguably because of mestizaje, Mexicans broadly and Mexican Americans, and specifically in the case that we're talking about, are inheritors, heirs to a kind of pan-indigenous Mexican identity. And there are going to be a lot of people who don't like this kind of stuff. But here's the deal. Neither you nor I know with any kind of certainty what our indigenous heritage comes from. We don't,
just to clarify, you're talking about what I was saying earlier, where there's that overlap like Greek and Roman?
Yes.
Okay.
To some extent. I'll clarify in just a second. So neither you nor I know specifically with a certainty, I'm assuming, although there may be like family rumors and so forth and stories that have been passed down.
Exactly. I could be immortal.
You could be immortal. That's possible. And you would,
I'm not confirming that.
Yeah. You might be actually Toltec and you're just like aping modern Texan patterns of speech and so forth.
The beard helps.
The beard does help. Yeah. So we don't know where we came from. We don't know whether the indigenous part of our ancestry came from the Nahuas or from the Purepecha or from the Tarahumara, the Coahuitecos, or we don't know. We may have some like ballpark understanding, but we really don't know. So, like, where do we root ourselves? Well, there were two civilizations that spread themselves pretty thoroughly throughout what is now Mexico and left their mark all over the place. One of them is that broad, like, Pan-Mayan kind of identity that, we talked about how obviously, especially today, when you talk about Maya people, you're talking about 24 or so different groups, but also Nahua, the Aztec Empire at its height, and this is to some extent true of the Toltecs as well, spread its influence and its language and its culture to nearly every corner of what we consider to be Mesoamerica, and even beyond that into northern Mexico and the Southwest. Nahuatl languages are spoken from the border with the U.S. Southwest all the way down into Central America. So those traditions, that Uto-Aztecan Nahuatl tradition, I think is like broader, and arguably is something that anybody in Mexico, modern Mexican or Mexican American, can lay some claim to. Obviously, in ethnic Nahuas that live today, and there are about 2.5 million ethnic Nahuas living in different parts of Mexico today, and about 1.5 of them speak a different variants of Nahuatl. They obviously have a stronger claim to those traditions, but I don't think that it can be said that we have no claim to them at all. And if we write about them with respect and we use them in ways that are about deepening or centering our indigenous, or the indigenous elements of our identity, I think that we can do good work that is not hurtful, that's respectful, and I think that we have a right to it. And not everybody's going to see it that way. I've had pushback from some people who tell me that there's no reason that I should be studying or teaching Nahuatl, that I shouldn't be, writing the stories, whatever. But they're a minority. It's a much more radical view. I think most other people understand that these pre-Columbian beliefs and language customs are things that multiple different groups can tap into and use in positive, beneficial ways. What we don't want is for them to be used in ways that are just merely titillating, or for using that like this white gazy, oh, look at all the bloodthirsty Aztecs and ripping people's hearts out, like you get with Jennings' novel Aztec in the 80s, which is, though thoroughly researched, is just kind of like a conglomeration of every negative thing he could find, that Gary Jennings can find, like strung together so that people could just like get their rocks off reading about how nasty the Aztecs could be. And that kind of thing is not what I am in the slightest proposing be done with these stories, but that they be retold and utilized and brought into modern vernacular in ways that are respectful of that source material. And I think that Mexican Americans are, especially in to speak of these two broad categories of Aztec and Maya civilizations pre-Cortez, we are uniquely situated to do that kind of work in the U.S. because there are not a lot of ethnic Nahuas living and writing in the U.S. And so if those stories are going to be told in English, like that's work that we've got to do. I would be extremely supportive of any ethnic Nahua who is interested in doing that kind of stuff, and would get them connected with an agent and a publisher, and would help get that work into English. I'm down for doing any of that. But because as U.S. citizens, part of an ethnic group that descends from those people, I think that I don't want to like beat a dead horse, but I do think that we have a right to those stories.
And maybe a duty to bring that out. David, I feel like we could keep going on this topic for a while, but in fact, we should definitely talk again on this. But I want to thank you so much for being part of this conversation, being part of Geekspanic Heritage Month. Can I ask real quick, where can we find you online, and when are your upcoming books coming out, if you have dates for them already?
Yeah, cool. So people can find me online at davidbowles.us. That's my website. You can follow me on Twitter at David O. Bowles. That's also my Instagram handle, at David O. Bowles. Those are the places where you'll find me the most active. On my website, you'll find links to my books and to published articles and stories and poetry on the web. This fall, In September, the Rise of the Halfling King comes out. Then I have the fourth book in the 13th Street series coming out on November 10th, I believe it is. And also in November is the Spanish translation of They Call Me Güero, Me Dicen Güero, which I translated myself. And the Spanish version of Rise of the Halfling King will also be coming out in this fall. And then in the spring, the first book in the Clockwork Curandera series is coming out from Lee and Lowe's 2 books imprint. That is the Witch Owl Parliament. And also that will be when book 5 of 13th Street comes out. And in the summer, my debut picture book is coming out from my 2 border towns through Penguin Random House, through their Coquila imprint. And also in the summer, book 6 of the 6th and final book of 13th Street is coming out. And I've also got 2 translations coming out next year, translations of other authors' work, a Colombian author and a Mexican author. The book that I translated from a Mexican author is actually really interesting in terms of our conversation. It's called The Sea-Ringed World, Sacred Stories of the Americas, and it is they're retellings of sacred stories from all over the American continent. So that's something to look out for as well.
David, it has been amazing talking with you. And I want to just once again thank you so much for being part of this. And thank you guys for listening today to the discussion with David Bowles as we've talked about Hispanic heritage and pre-Hispanic heritage as it's been part of Geekspanic Heritage Month, which again goes from September 15th to October 15th. For this and other content focused on Hispanic heritage and Latinx culture, please visit www.nerdtinoexpo.com and be sure to follow Nerdtino on all those social media places. You can find out more about me at monomythic.com or kevingarcia.com. And David, it's been an honor talking with you. Thank you and good night.